In the life cycle of buildings, people come together to collaborate. At times, there is alignment of interests between collaborators and enduring trust is built. I spoke with two people whose values and objectives aligned in a book project about Usonia, a residential community in Mount Pleasant, New York, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Michael Biondo, an architectural photographer who says, collaboration requires sacrificing some of your ego.
If you're talking, you're not learning.
And Gideon Fink Shapiro, an architectural historian and writer who describes himself as a perfectionist without being a control freak.
I think it's really important to be open to a slightly different outcome.
7 years ago, Michael was commissioned to photograph 3 houses in Usonia. This sparked a deep curiosity about Usonia and eventually led to a book commission about the Usonia community, with Gideon as his writing partner. Michael, I understand you knew at age 12 that you were going to become a photographer.
Yeah, I was on the path. Yeah, I had the bug. I was on the path and in the darkroom at around 12.
Okay. And what did that look like? Like, what were your influences? How is it that you knew you were going to be a photographer?
Well, at that age, I was just trying to keep myself occupied and, looking for the next shiny thing to, play with. So cameras and lenses and all of that was, in the darkroom, and the magic of watching a print come up in the developer. All of that was really attractive to me. It wasn't until I was probably around 15 or 16 that I started looking at photography pretty seriously. And at that time, it was Minor White, Paul Strand, Edward Weston, of course, Ansel Adams. They were the ones that I was looking at.
And you made your way to Pratt, you studied photography, and then entering into the professional world, you worked in fashion photography for a number of years. Why fashion, and how was that journey?
Interesting. Going to school in New York, I assisted a lot of fashion photographers here during the summer and as a part-time job during the school year. So I was exposed to that world, and what 20-year-old guy doesn't want to be a fashion photographer in 1982, in New York City? It was pretty wild. So it was an exciting run, probably right up till about 2006.
Yeah, in 2006, you came together with Alan Greenberg, and he commissioned a project with you to capture some of his building process. Is that right?
That's right. I was introduced to Alan through a friend of mine, Scott Wood, who worked for Alan. And Alan asked me to photograph some of his projects to go into his monograph that was being published by Rizzoli at the time. And I had no idea who Alan was and where he lived in the world of architecture in terms of style and philosophy. And I was totally green, and I was total blank slate for me. So I looked at photographing his work from a formal point of view: shape, texture, tone, balance, massing. All of those elements were elements that I was primarily concerned with. And it was an incredible experience.
And you worked with Alan for many years.
Yes, I worked with Alan up until when he retired a few years ago.
So Gideon, I understand you studied architecture at Columbia University, and you took some studio courses there, and then found along the way that you loved it, but you realized, okay, as much as I love architecture, I don't see myself going down the practice path. And you somehow found your way to writing about architecture. Tell me a little bit about that.
I was an urban studies major at Columbia, and that allowed me to be an adventurer in terms of my intellectual and creative interests. That was the good thing about it. The tough thing about it was, coming out of college, I could still do anything. But I was drawn to the world of architecture, in part because I did get a chance to take studio courses at Columbia. During these studio courses, I fell in love with architecture, but I also realized I was not really cut out for design. I was attracted to design as a discipline and as a process. In particular, this challenge of working with your head and working with your hands. Hands can be metaphorically with the computer as well. Thinking and making this fantastic dialogue. But at a certain level, you realize you're just not cut out for it. But what I was good at was writing, storytelling, theorizing, making sense of design. What is the purpose of design? What does it mean? What is its significance? What are the inspirations for a design prompt? And by a combination of luck and purpose, I started working for architects, sort of in a marketing, communications, storytelling capacity, at times also in the concept design and precedent research process. And so from very early on, I saw that even in contemporary architecture, there can be a role for a little bit of a historical perspective, even if it's the very recent past, not to copy it, but as a creative spur. So whether that might be references from the fine arts or from architectural history, or even looking at sort of geology and landscape, this whole realm of bringing research into the architectural design process was something that I was drawn to and found that I could actually be useful at. The writing part happened simultaneously, and I started contributing to magazines and blogs. And so I became an architectural journalist. And then I thought, wouldn't it be cool to write books for a living? Well, how do you write books for a living in architecture? Because I fell in love with architecture books as much as the buildings. I decided that the way to do that would be to get a PhD in architectural history and theory. And so I went to Penn, quit my job in architecture, became an academic, tried that on for a while. It was great. I loved the intellectual freedom, but found my way back to the world of sort of practice and even the commercial side of things simply because it's more dynamic and I respond well to other people's creative challenges.
So let's talk about that, this dynamic of collaboration and the way you're coming together with practitioners when you're working inside of practices or consulting with architectural practitioners. How do you look at what the team is doing and work with them and talk about the architecture, communicate about the architecture in ways that augment the architecture or even just explain the architecture? Because as you know, architects are not always the best at communicating verbally or in written form about their work.
It's really great fun. And it starts with listening and looking for me. The looking part, I think, comes from the training of working in architecture where you can look at a site, look at a building. Also, my training as a historian to know what to ask of a building or of an archive. But, I like to listen to the words people use, architects and designers. But we have to go deeper than that, because if my job is to help find better words, then I need to go on a site tour with architects. I need to go, into their drawings or into their meetings and just hear them kind of riff. So for me, it really starts with listening and asking questions and not always trusting the language too much. It's the thing about language. I mean, I'm sort of a wordsmith, but I also am always a bit mistrustful and suspicious of language because it's slippery. And if my job is to find better words for something, that tells you inherently that there's always more than one way to say something. So what I love about architecture in a way is that it's mute. On the other hand, they're the opposite. I mean, architecture is so expressive, and the 18th century theorists talked of architectural parlante, architecture that speaks, which is also sort of the point. So buildings themselves don't talk, but that's precisely the opening for us to talk about them.
So I understand one of the books that you recently worked on was a book about Frank Lloyd Wright. Talk a little bit about that and how that came to be and some of your experience there.
I did this book project with Aaron Betsky called 50 Lessons to Learn from Frank Lloyd Wright. And Aaron spent 5 years as head of the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture at Taliesin, literally living in Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings and campuses where Master of Architecture students were also living and working, culminating in their thesis project of building desert shelters. And after living in Frank Lloyd Wright for 4 or 5 years, Aaron had a lot to say, mainly about what designers today could learn from Wright, which is a different question than most historians have asked about Wright's work in recent years. Most books about Wright deal with the person, the figure, the man, the myth. And Aaron and I, when I came on board, we're after something different. We're saying, well, we know Wright has to come off this pedestal. Actually, he doesn't do us any good when he's this mythical hero figure in architecture. Architecture has too many mythical heroes and giants. And we know that part of the problem of the culture and commerce of architecture is that it rewards this system of lone geniuses, which you wrote about very eloquently, Drew, in your recent newsletter. Architecture is a lot about collaboration, but when we look at someone like Frank Lloyd Wright, the exercise became, is it possible to step back from this huge shadow that Wright casts and instead look at the work? And if we actually look at the work with innocent eyes, in a sense, or from Aaron's point of view, from 5 years of literally living in the homes and the schools that he designed, what can we learn today that's relevant to students, practitioners, and anyone else who's interested? So we read the writing. We found quotes that supported the lessons that we wanted to highlight. But the point was to actually get past those words and get past most of what's said about Wright and really look at the work. So for me as a writer, one of the greatest joys and challenges is to write from the material reality of architecture and the spatial experience that it provides. That's what got me into this mess in the first place.
So, Michael, you had a commission about 7 years ago to photograph 3 houses in Usonia. That commission then led to publication in New York Magazine. You came together with Wendy Goodman, the well-regarded editor there. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, it was a wonderful project that I photographed for Mark Rolfs and Rudy Ellert at REO Studios. They were a client, and they asked me to come to Usonia and photograph 3 houses that they had worked on in terms of renovating in Usonia. And that project was just awesome. It was incredible. I knew nothing about Usonia. For me, Usonia was just a question mark. It was like I kind of knew it was there, and I kind of knew it had something to do with Frank Lloyd Wright, but I didn't quite get it. And it was just kind of vague. So it was really, really fantastic to get in there and get the Cook's tour from, 2 architects that have worked on many, many houses in the community. The photographs that were published in New York Magazine were picked up from the shoot that I did. And I never had a chance to really meet Wendy Goodman. But, it's, of course, I'm flattered to have my photographs published alongside of her byline. Hopefully someday I'll get a chance to meet her.
I hope so. Let's see if we can make that happen. So then you developed an interest, a continuing interest in Usonia, and that's now evolved into a signed contract with Rizzoli, and you're on your way to publishing a book. But how did you get from the original commission, the original learnings that you developed at Usonia to where you are now? How did it evolve to become a book project?
Well, you, Drew.
Come on, really?
You introduced me to Gideon. And I remember sitting at this very table talking to you, and you were like, well, I was saying, I think there's a real great book project here, but I need the time and energy and a partner to do it with. And you said, well, let's see if we can make that happen. And you did.
I recall, tell me if I'm wrong, a deep-seated interest on your part in Usonia, and there's almost need to tell a story about it. Right? Like there's a story calling out to be told about this place that's so interesting.
Well, yes. I mean, the place is extremely interesting. And it's an interesting case study of what can go right and what can go wrong in American suburbs. And my interest was in what really went right with Usonia and how it really is just, just a beautiful example of how a suburban planned community can work out. And you don't see that very often. I was born in a Levittown, which is the grid of, monotonous house after house after house, exactly the same. And Usonia is the polar opposite of that. And so I just was very curious about what made Usonia tick. And that inspires a book project because I need to have an excuse and a good reason to go in and explore these subjects a little bit more in depth. Like I use my camera as an excuse to, photograph be in interesting spaces. It's a bit of a passport in that regard. The book project is a bit of a passport into the world of Usonia.
So Gideon, talk to me about your meeting Michael, beginning to talk to Michael about his project, how that took shape, and how the two of you worked out a way to negotiate a book deal with Rizzoli.
Well, thank you and your team for introducing Michael and I. It's been a fun collaboration so far, and it's the type of thing that, I couldn't have predicted. Michael had a pretty clear idea for this book already, but there was still enough play in that vision for us to kind of define how this would be developed and how it could be developed. And I think that's a successful start. We hadn't worked together before, and it was pretty easy for us to pick up and start working together. I think part of that is because, our personalities happen to be compatible. Michael's a good guy. He's a perfectionist about his work, which is why it's so good, but he's also not a control freak when it comes to this kind of book project. And I'd like to think I'm a little bit of the same way. I'm highly controlling when it comes to my choice of words on paper, although I'm also open to movement. So when I work with a great editor, I love when editors who really get it suggest a better way to say something or point out if something's redundant or unclear. But when it comes to teaming up with people who have another skill set, I think it's really important to be open to a slightly different outcome or a little bit of a shift in vision. And so together, Michael and I talked about what this project could be, why he was fascinated with Usonia, why he's been spending time there over the past few years photographing in his free time and interviewing residents like Roland Risley, who I think is the last living resident there who personally knew Frank Lloyd Wright. My role was to help Michael develop that idea in terms of shaping it into a sellable book project and also one that had intellectual integrity from my point of view as a historian. And Michael was open to my ideas, and he also drew the line sometimes where he said, no, but that's not what this is about. This is why I'm here. And I was open to his priorities as well. On a very pragmatic level, the next step we took was developing a written book proposal. That's basically my job, starting from what Michael had written, but I rewrote most of that based on our conversations together. This was an area where I felt I could make a difference in terms of writing persuasively to a publisher and selling this.
So Michael is stuck, in a sense, right? He had this great idea and a story he wanted to tell, but he was stuck. And creatives, people in our world, often find themselves in a place where they're stuck. And so do you think it's fair to say that the engagement of collaboration sometimes helps us move things forward that we couldn't otherwise? Seems to be something of what happened here.
Yes, I completely agree. I mean, that's one of the great things about this type of process is it's easy to get stuck on your own. That helped us move along. Michael, I don't know that he would describe himself as stuck, although I think he was at a point in a process where he was looking for help. And similarly, if I had been asked to sort of develop this alone, I'm sure, it wouldn't have come to anything.
I don't know if I've always was a active collaborator, I kind of was a lone wolf, and following that path as a photographer is, you're in your own world, you're looking through the viewfinder, nobody else is involved, and you're composing and creating the images. That all changed when I started working with stylists in fashion and working with models and hair and makeup artists and designers. The team effort, you really were only as good as what was in front of your camera, and you needed these individuals to make photographs. So you had to learn to play nice and not be too much of a curmudgeon, and to be flexible and try to be easy to work with, so to speak, so that these incredibly talented people would want to work with you. And I think that translates into working in architecture as well, and interiors.
Mm-hmm. Seems right. It's a means to an end. working well, finding your way to working well with other people is a means to a better product. In your case, a photograph. In the case of you're coming together with Gideon, it takes the form of a book. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, do you?
No, not at all. I think I mentioned a while back to you in one of our conversations about the architect Kengo Kuma and how he talks about cultivating the mindset of a beginner. And it follows that same logic that if you're talking, you're not learning. And so that you need to listen and be sensitive and be open to the ideas that are around you. And so collaboration requires, I think, you have to sacrifice a little bit of the ego. But that's the only way to, in the long term, satisfy the ego by creating better work.
So collaboration is, in a sense, a leverage tool. But it turns out that the way it tends to work best is when both people are leveraging one another and both people are benefiting from the engagement. So as you and Gideon are working together, how are you thinking about this in relation to your objectives? Because you each have different but related objectives for the book that you're publishing, right? So let's talk a little bit about that.
Gideon's a scholar. Gideon is, and I'm a motive formalist, visual, sensual photographer. So he's looking at this community and these projects from a completely different perspective than what I'm looking at. And so I think for the project to be well-rounded, it needs Gideon. And in a way, it needs me as well. So our interests, they cohabitate very well in the service of creating a book, I think. Mm-hmm. We'll see.
So there are a lot of barriers to success in our industry for people who work in the built environment like you and me. If you could change one thing about our professional environment, what would you change?
That's a good question. Well, much in the way that I'm benefiting from learning from Gideon and his scholarly approach and knowledge of all things Frank Lloyd Wright and all things design and architecture oriented, I would love to see more dialogue between people like myself, the sensualists, the emotive creative types, and a more rationalist intellectual perspective. In other words, I'd love to see the professional and the academic come together a little bit more and collaborate a bit. I think both could benefit from each other's perspectives of the world.
Well, Drew, I share your interest in a more collaborative profession. I'm frustrated by the emphasis and rewards of sole authorship as much in writing as in the design professions. And so I think it would be wonderful if in our profession as a crossover of creative fields from architecture, design, and writing about them, there was an easier way to credit and reward joint efforts and creative partnerships.
Love that. Thank you. Then there's the question, does the work product open up to other audiences that you may not access otherwise? A lay audience, a consumer audience, for instance. Do you think about things like this?
Not really, although I think that the work becomes better. I do believe the cream rises to the top and, at the end of the day. And I do think that you have to get the information out there. I was in your library looking at a Louis Barragan book that you had picked up, a book I'd never seen before. And I saw these fences that were really unusual and I'd seen them in a design done by a very, very prominent architect about 8 or 9 years ago, and I had never seen that fence design before, but I'm looking in this book in your library and I'm seeing that it was done in 1940. And Louis Barragan did it. And I'm also looking in the Louis Barragan book and I'm seeing that he has pools there that are very similar to the Donald Judd pools that are in Marfa, Texas. And so learning from history is what I think we could all benefit from because there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. We all can stand on each other's shoulders as time goes on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are some of the objectives behind the book project? What are you all looking to achieve?
Michael's been fascinated by Usonia, New York, which is this community that Frank Lloyd Wright master planned, but didn't build many houses of for years. He came to me with this set of issues, right? And I sort of slowly came to see that it's interesting, not because it is one of Frank Lloyd Wright's masterpieces. It's actually sort of the opposite. It's interesting because it doesn't have Frank Lloyd Wright's sort of stamp of authorship all over it. Instead, it was this place that had a Frank Lloyd Wright influence and was subsequently developed over generations. Today, the homeowners there are adhering more or less to the master plan, but are in this position, a really interesting position of either preserving, restoring, renovating, or rebuilding, and working with contemporary architects to do that property by property. So the creative act that happened in the late 1940s, early 1950s, a community getting together, bringing in Frank Lloyd Wright, doing a master plan, a couple of houses, and other architects to design those houses. That series of creative actions has now kind of created multiple creative opportunities for contemporary architects and homeowners to figure out, what does Usonia mean today? And so our current working title is Searching for Usonia. We like Searching for Usonia because it is about this continual process of defining, what is this place? What are the underlying values and how do those translate into architecture? Because there are some real values about how a community comes together, how buildings relate to the land, and yet there are still any number of architectural responses to those values. And so we're really looking at that.
What next with this book project? Talk about how you guys are envisioning things and some of the steps that you're going to take, right? And some of the things that we might have to look forward to.
Now that we've passed a kind of co-visioning process, I think it's actually time for us to buckle down and each do what we're good at for a little while, and then come back together and collaborate again. So we've been through this kind of co-visioning process. There's still a few factors in play, but in a sense, now it's time for Michael to go take pictures, and it's time for me to go write an essay. Along the way, we are going to be checking in with each other, because the story that he's telling through his photos and the sort of arguments or questions that I'm exploring through my writing really need to inform each other, and we need to make sure that they're on the same page. And as creative partners, what he thinks about what I'm writing and what I think about the photos he's taking does matter. But I think there's also a level of respect where, each of us is sort of going to have the final say on what our work product is going to be. But we're already at a point where I know that where we can freely engage and exchange ideas, and that's a great feeling.
Michael, if people want to learn more about you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Follow me on Instagram at Mike Biondo Photo, and go to my website, www.michaelbiondo.com, if I can plug that, and reach out and send me an email. I love talking shop.
And when can people look for the new book on Usonia to be published?
Late spring of 2025.
Okay, well, look out for that.
If all goes according to schedule.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Drew.
Thank you, Drew. Pleasure to be here.
That was Michael Biondo, an architectural photographer, and Gideon Fink Shapiro, an architectural historian and writer whose upcoming book on Usonia will frame questions about what went wrong with American suburbia and lessons we can glean from Frank Lloyd Wright's little-known work in suburban planning. Thank you so much for joining us. This episode was produced by the team at Radio Kismet, including Christopher Plant, Ben Giese, Cameron Starr, and Justin Berger. The production and editing staff also included Brick and Wonder team members Ed Thompson, Zoe Metcalf-Claw, and Carrie Potter. I'm Drew Lang, and you've been listening to the Brick and Wonder podcast.